Hi folks, I'm Collin Fossen from Laramie, Wyoming with XLR Industries and Maven Optics. I just got my new XLR Evolution Chassis from the good guys down in Grand Junction. This one's for a CZ455. I'm going to be putting my Maven RS1 rifle scope on it. So the first thing you want to do when you get this thing is unbox everything and make sure you have all your gear. So I also got from them a set of medium height scope rings and an Arca rail adapter. So I'm going to be using the fix-it sticks that you can get from XLR. Comes in a nice pack. The tools that I'm going to use tonight are the 5/32 Allen key, the 3/32 Allen key, T25 Torx, the included action screw Allen key that's a ball end, which is really handy, and then the 25-pound and 45-pound torque limiters that come with the fix-it kit. So always make sure and check your firearms visually, physically. Make sure they're unloaded before you do any work. I got the bolt taken out of this just so that it's not in my way while I'm working. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my chassis over and use the 5/32 Allen to take out the 6 bolts that hold on the handguard, and they'll just spin out. So once those are out, I'm going to hold the top nut and tip this over in my hand so that all 6 of those screws come out and I can set them to the side so I don't lose anything. Then the handguard just has the top nut and then an indexing screw, which is also one of those 5/32 screws, but you don't have to take that one out to put this together. So while this is off, I'm going to take my Arca rail adapter and line up my keys on the bottom, flip it over, and insert it right onto the M-lock slots of the rail. Then I'm going to use that 3/32 Allen to spin those down. And as you do that, what happens is those little wing nuts are going to spin 90 degrees and lock onto the rail. Sometimes they need a little help. I'm just going to make these hand tight, and then I'll go back and torque everything at the end. So once that rail's on, I'm going to set that to the side. I'm going to hold my chassis up and drop the action right in the top. Just kind of making sure that the screws are lining up, nothing's interfering. Flip that whole assembly over and insert the action screws that come with your chassis. There's a short one and a long one. The short screw is going to go in the front, and I'm going to use the action screw wrench, and the long one's going to go in the back. I'm just going to get those snugged hand tight because I'm still going to need to do a little fitment before I torque this down. So once that's in, it's pretty hand tight. So I'm going to take my handguard tube and slide it over the end of the barrel. I'm going to lift up to make sure that I get it over that detent screw so that it doesn't come out. Then I'm going to take the top nut, and you can see there's a little bit of a chase at the back edge of this. That needs to go at the back edge to make sure that it sits on there right. If you have that towards the front, it's not going to fit. So I'm going to flip my whole assembly over, set it on my bench upside down, and then use that 5/32 bit again to start putting these action screws in. Alright, so once you get your action screws snug down a little bit, make sure that you don't have too much gap between the chassis and that top barrel nut. And it'll definitely start going away as you torque these screws down. With these screws, you want to try and probably torque them in somewhat of a lug nut fashion. So because all 6 screws are in 3 and 3, I'm going to do a couple sets with my 25 inch-pound torque limiter and just go cross nuts to make sure that I'm getting an even torque across that whole nut, just like I was doing scope rings. And then I'm going to use the 45 inch-pound limiter and the action screw wrench to do the rear nut on the action, and then the front nut on the action. Now we've got our action in there. I'm going to just double check, make sure I don't have anything in there, and put my bolt back in to make sure I don't have anything that's hitting, nothing interfering in there. You can see that it's got a little bit of a relief cut for that bolt so that it slides up and back really nice. I'm going to take my bolt back out. And then I'm going to use the 25 inch-pound limiter to just put the final tweak on that arc rail. And then I'm going to use my T25 Torx bit and my 25-pound limiter to start putting on the scope rings. These are 30mm medium rings. They're what I'm going to need for my Maven scope to be able to clear that handguard. So what I like to do is get the gun so that it's set up and level, and then I will check just with a small hand level to make sure that my rail's level before I go and mount my scope up. So it's looking pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and put my rings on. When doing this, I like to make sure that the screw for the rings sits to the left side of the action as you were looking down it. And then I'm just going to tighten those on there. The bottom screw for these rings, you're going to want to use your 45 inch-pound torque limiter, but then the top screws, you're only going to want to use the 25-pound inch limiter. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my 45 inch-pound. Just make sure those are on that rail, front, and then rear. Then I'm going to take the tops of the rings off so that I can fit my scope in there. Alright, now that I've got my scope rings off, I'm going to set my scope right down on those rings. So now that I've got my scope setting in the rings, what I'm going to do is put the tops of the rings back on. Just going to set them up there. Make sure the screws are getting aligned. And then I'm going to put them in just less than finger tight. It's important to make sure, again, that you're kind of keeping a finger on both sides to make sure that you don't have a large gap on one side and no gap on the other of your rings as you're putting them in. Your rings should have just a little bit of gap between the top and the body. And it should be fairly equal on both sides. So now I'm going to use my level again. I'm going to throw it right on my rail. Make sure that my rail is sitting pretty level. And then I'm going to level the scope, since it should be just barely hand tight, barely finger tight in those rings. I'm going to level the scope to the rail. So once you're pretty confident that the scope is leveled on the rail, I'm going to put my 25-inch pound limiter in there, and I'm just going to do the frontmost two rings just so that they're snugged down. That should keep your scope from twisting, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to check the eye relief. So what I want is I want this scope to sit a little bit further forward. So I'm going to loosen those two screws just a little bit, push my whole scope assembly forward, trying to make sure that I don't lose my level, but I'm going to check it again. And then I'm going to check my eye relief again. It's looking pretty good. I like to set my scope so that it looks pretty level, and then I'll just do one final level check. Now we're ready to torque down the rings. So the same as with the rings for the handguard tube, I'm going to want to use all 8 of these rings and kind of snug them. All 8 of these screws for my scope rings in an alternating fashion. So I want to do the front ring first and then the rear ring into my scope rings. So you can see I've got some gap between the body and the top of that ring, and it's pretty well matched on the other side. So I know those rings are going to be pretty good and consistent. The only thing left to do is put my bolt back in and verify that I've got my clearances for my bolt on my scope. These medium rings are nice because they let your bolt clear just about every set of scope eyepieces that there are out there. The only thing I have left is my Thunder Beast Takedown 22 suppressor, and then I have a sweet little can cover, which isn't necessary on the 22, but it just makes it look cool. So there you have it. That's how you put together a XLR Industries chassis.